Annie Austin, the most boring place in Tears of the Kingdom. Let's watch it.
Okay, check this out. All the way at the top of the map in The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is a tiny strip of land that separates an infinitely wide ocean from an infinitely deep canyon. And on that tiny strip of land, you'll find absolutely nothing. This unassuming strip of land, which is one of my favorite places in the game, by the way, has nothing to do with any of the game's quests. It doesn't have any special enemies to fight. There are no treasure chests to open. There's no reason to come here. For our purposes, this is one of the most boring places in all of Tears of the Kingdom. But is it the most boring place in all of Tears of the Kingdom? That's what I want to dive into today, and places like this are the types of places I want to show you today. Places with nothing. Places far from the beaten path. Places you've never even thought about, much less actually visited. Personally, I have a strong opinion on what I think the most boring place in the entire game is, and I'll share that with you later, but there are a lot of other places worth considering as well, so we'll start by showing you a few of those. Like, for example, way up above the Gerudo Desert, far away from most of the game's main quest activities, you can find this small snowy plateau in the Gerudo Highlands. On it, you'll find a few berries to pick, you'll find some rocks, you'll find an enemy outpost. It's a lonely little place that really makes you feel like you're high up in the mountains away from civilization. If you take a little time, you can climb even further up over another ridge, and if you do that, you'll find this. This is really the area I want to show you first. This place is so desolate, so neat, so boring, that I spent an entire afternoon just pacing back and forth trying to figure out if there was some sort of secret that I was missing, but there isn't. Now, there is one more ledge up here that leads to an even higher plateau, but unfortunately, you can't climb it because it represents the edge of the game world. The only way you can get up there is to shoot way up into the sky and then skydive back down onto it, and even then, you can only stand on a little bitty part towards the edge. Now, up on this ledge, the only interactivity is from the random enemies that periodically spawn, and that's basically the case anywhere you go in Tears of the Kingdom. No matter how remote or boring a spot is, the game will periodically spawn climate-appropriate enemies for you to fight, meaning that you're never going to go too long without having a little something to do. This game. What I really appreciate about this is that it feels totally video game. I know there's probably some in-universe biological explanation for how each of the choo-choos evolved for the distinct climate that they're in, but I feel like we all know that the enemies in this game aren't placed for the cohesion of the lore, they're placed for the cohesion of the gameplay. Now, believe it or not, there are some very specific places you can find in Tears of the Kingdom that are so boring that they don't even have these randomly spawning enemies to fight. So I'm going to show you some of those next. Okay, let's take a look at another place that could qualify as the most boring place in the entire game. Right here. Welcome to a small outcropping on the side of a useless pillar in the middle of a lake that you never need to visit. There are several of these pillars in this lake, all of which surround Rito Village, but I like this one the best because it's the smallest one. This is one of the few places in the game you can find that doesn't have any enemy spawns, which at least in theory makes it more boring than the last place we looked at. The most interesting thing about this place is that on top of this pillar there is a rock, and if you want, you can take that rock from the top of the pillar to the bottom of the pillar very carefully, and then, if you're even more careful, you can drop that rock into the water and it will stay there. It'll come to rest on top of a submerged outcropping of the pillar beneath the waterline. That's the most interesting thing about this pillar. It's a boring pillar. Places like this in Tears of the Kingdom feel so remote that it almost feels like you're hiding from God when you're here. God being the developer, of course. Not literally God. Nobody can hide from God. Like, you know how anytime you use any piece of software nowadays, it's constantly sending detailed reports of everything you're doing to the developer, ostensibly so they can, you know, make the game better and optimize it and whatever. But, you know, actually so they can sell the data to third parties, probably. I'm not a developer. Don't attack me. It feels like anything you do in this little space would be hidden even from that. I love it. And there's another place in the game that gives me the same feeling. It's way up there. This rock is one of many similar rocks floating around the world of Tears of the Kingdom as part of the Sky Islands. They don't contain any retrievable goods for the most part, and they might be the furthest single point you can get from every other living object in the game. Living, you know. It's computers, but whatever. You ever read about those comets that come around once every 70 years, and then for 69 straight years, they just meander aimlessly in the black vacuum? This is that. We are on that comet. I say aimlessly. I guess it's not aimless because it's gravity, but whatever. Having a campfire on one of these little sort of asteroid islands is a pretty magical experience as well, because the campfire mechanic in this game doesn't just pass the time, it also grounds you in the world by forcing you to have a moment of role-playing. Link made a fire and slept all night on this lonely floating rock. That's a really weird and beautiful thing. If you crawl down the side of one of these floating rocks and hang your feet off the bottom, you get this really weird sense of your own mortality and possibly vertigo, and it suddenly makes the game feel a lot more present and physical than it does when you're just running around collecting shrines. There are other strange, boring, lonely places in the sky as well. If you make a point to stop and land on the sides of the rocks during those courage testing minigames, you end up in another strange place with nothing to do. There are also other small islands, a little bit bigger than that single rock, but still pretty small, that just have like a bit of grass or a tree on them. In some ways, these places feel even more boring than the place we looked at originally, because the grass almost creates this like anticipation of a purpose, even though the island doesn't have a purpose. We'll talk more about that idea a little bit later. Now, these sky islands are one of the main additions that Nintendo made to this game to differentiate it from Breath of the Wild, which uses the same map, but the other big addition also comes with its fair share of boring places, and that's going to be way down here. Beneath the surface of Hyrule, you'll find the depths, which is like a strange inverted version of the overworld that's full of cursed goblins and has a really interesting skybox. Now, I think a lot of people feel like the depths in general are just a boring place because it lacks any real visual variety from location to location, which is true. And the majority of what you do down here is sort of just grinding for a certain material to help you upgrade your abilities, which is also true. But I totally disagree with the assessment that the depths as a whole is boring, even though I agree with the underlying facts. And if this was a review of Tears of the Kingdom, I would go into details, but since it's not, let me just tell you about the most boring place down here in the depths. Just to the west of the abandoned Gerudo mine is an area up against...
Why is he showing footage of Clancyville +2? +2. This is exactly what Clancyville
the western wall of the depths, and in this area, there isn't anything substantive to do. Kind of a running theme today. What's so boring about this space is that, unlike a lot of the other places we've been in, it's still pretty dense visually. It has the same gnarled, organic look that the rest of the depths has, only in between all of those mushroom trees and twisting rocks, there isn't actually anything to do. You can sometimes find your generic enemies or maybe some Poe souls to collect, but in terms of curated interactions, nothing. I spent about 40 minutes walking back and forth in this area, taking in the vibes, and the only thing I found that I felt was legitimately interesting was this hole in the ground. It doesn't have a purpose, but it's kind of unique and unexpected. If you go in it, you get hurt. That's it. What's interesting about this whole area is that it's precisely because it looks less boring that it feels more boring. Let me explain. When we're standing on a rock floating thousands...
No, that's true. It's like Caelid in fucking Elden Ring. It's more boring to run around, but it looks less boring. It's thousands
of feet above Hyrule, we're not actually expecting very much. What we see is what we get, because we can see everything that there is to see, right? But down here, so much of the space is obfuscated by the terrain that you're wandering around with a lot more anticipation of something interesting being around the next bend, and then because there isn't anything, you really feel the absence of that content more profoundly than you do when a space is clearly empty from the jump. It reminds me a little bit of what would probably be one of my favorite games of all time if I would just play it, which is Shadow of the Colossus. For the most part, people don't really complain about that game being boring. Instead, they use words like empty and desolate and atmospheric, and I think that's mostly due to how the game manages expectations rather than whether or not the game actually has interesting things to do at every moment. Thinking about things in this way...
9 minutes, folks. 9 minutes for a video game video essay to bring up Shadow of the Colossus. That's actually a pretty good time. Like, he actually made 9 whole minutes before bringing up Shadow of the Colossus, and I think we got to give credit where credit's due. He held out for longer than most. Really,
also partly solved something about these 2 newest Zelda games that was puzzling me while I was pondering this video. Why is it that despite the fact that the overworld in these games is so full of empty space, walking around in this game isn't generally very boring? And I think the main reason for this is just appropriately managed expectations. And that's something a lot of developers and
I want to hear what his most boring spot is.
Miss when thinking about video games. You cannot just boil the art of engagement into a simple yes or no inclusion. Everything in the game is interconnected, so it has to be considered as a whole thing. Anyway, I have one final spot that I want to show you that I think is the most boring spot in the entire game. But before I show you that, I also asked all of you if you had places that you thought were the most boring spots. So let me tell tell you a few of those excellent answers that you guys gave first, right? The first one comes from Ari is Exhausted, who mentions the area right before you go get the big horse. The big horse is down in the southeast area of the map, and it's true that the whole beach area leading up to the little peninsula feels really empty. There are a couple of enemies here and there, and there's a Korok or maybe two, but it definitely feels like another one of those God can't see me here kind of spots, so I really like that one. Next one comes from Alex, who mentions this little island in the Necluda.
You know what place is even more boring than this? The entirety of the Pokemon Legends Arceus game. Just the whole fucking overworld for the whole fucking Pokemon game.
Sea.
Kind of,
Based on the map that he showed, I was expecting this place to be more boring than it actually ended up being. I get what they're saying about how there isn't anything to collect here, but you've got some boats to play with, there's some beautiful things to look at. It's just a nice little desert island. So I totally disagree with Alex, but I get it. This next spot comes from Dr. Jimmy Brungus. Oh no, excuse me. From Dr. Jungi Brungen, who says, south of Davil Peak is pretty unspectacular, and the doctor is right. This is a great place. You have to climb up a big wall to get to it, but once you do, it's just a big long valley that feels extremely artificial, separating the desert from the grasslands. And it's also absolutely full of tumbleweeds, which sort of makes it feel like one of the few, maybe intentionally boring places in the game. Like we're meant to think of it as strange and empty. Good choice, Dr. Brungen. Our last viewer suggestion comes from I'm Puppy, who circles a spot way up near the top of the map. I've been here before, and I love it. It feels similar to a lot of the places we've looked at, as though it was just kind of an afterthought or an accident. But one thing that sets it apart is that the pathways around it have these stone-throwing like-likes and fire choo-choos that really feel like a sort of unenthusiastic throwback to the iconic mountain sections of 2D Zelda games where you have to walk up some pathway dodging boulders and fighting enemies. This is a fun idea to throw back to something in the old Zelda games, but it like barely works.
This reminds me of this video's fine, it's good, I like this guy, but this reminds me of a really great video, which is like, what's the best spot in Dark Souls to smoke a blunt? We watched it on streamer and I watched it on my own, and it was just like different spots in Dark Souls that would be good to fucking smoke trees. That was a fire video.
Works in 3D, and they just barely put any effort into it. But despite the low effort, I really do like it, and I think it's kind of a fun sort of gameplay quote. Put a pin in that idea, actually. Gameplay quote. I feel like that's something that I've never heard anyone talk about, but it happens all the time, where you'll be playing one video game and it'll have a section that's very clearly a sort of homage to a section in a different video game, sort of like how jazz performers will quote famous passages from their songs while they improvise. Sure. We don't really have good language to talk about that in games, so let's figure that out. If I have to make the video, I will, but one of you should do it. I have other things to do. All right. My vote for most boring place in the entirety of Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild, come to think of it, is probably going to be a little bit of a controversial pick, and it isn't totally in the spirit of everything else we've talked about today, but I think that's exactly why it's the right move. Bear with me here, okay? Are you ready? Zora's Domain. Zora's Domain is boring. It has all of the problems of the depths, which is to say that I feel like there should be so much more going on, but there's not, as well as all of the weird empty spots from everywhere else that we talked about, like up on the walkways or down beneath the city. And it has a really sort of excessively busy, monotone architecture. I don't like that it's all blue. I think you need more colors than just blue. It makes me feel like I'm in like Dubai or some sort of planned city, which is fine. It's just ugly. All those things could be okay, except for the fact that it's also just way too big, which I think specifically means I'm just annoyed every time I have to walk up the stairs, because
Zora's Domain is Dubai coded is a funny sentence. I've never
it takes way too long to go up the stairs. And it feels like a missed opportunity in a game that otherwise has really excellent little towns and villages. So that's why Zora's Domain gets my vote for most boring place in Tears of the Kingdom. If you disagree with my choice, it's no big deal. This is not a very important topic. I'm honestly just trying to give you something to watch while you eat, and then give you maybe a little something to think about next time you play a video game. We don't need to fight. If you try to fight me in the comments, I will fight you, but we don't need to fight. We can love. I'm Annie Austin. Thanks for watching.
All right, I like the guy. I like this guy. That's just a great outro, to be honest.